Snow fell lightly over the quiet Vermont neighborhood as dawn broke, and inside a small blue house at the corner of Maple Street, Emily Harper stood alone in her kitchen holding a mug she had forgotten to drink from, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of her husband moving upstairs, and for reasons she could not yet explain, her chest felt tight, not with anger or sadness, but with the strange sense that something important had already shifted while she wasn't looking, as if life had quietly turned a page without asking her permission. 5 years of marriage had taught Emily how to read silence, how to measure days by routine rather than joy, how to smile politely while something inside her slowly went still, and this morning felt no different on the surface, yet beneath it all there was an unfamiliar warmth, a presence at her feet, steady and calm, where Cooper, their golden retriever, sat watching her with soft eyes and an unshakable focus, his tail resting against the floor like he had all the time in the world just for her. Emily lowered her gaze and met his, and in that simple moment she felt seen in a way that startled her, because it was not dramatic or loud or demanding, it was gentle, and that gentleness pressed against something fragile inside her that had been untouched for years. Upstairs, Michael adjusted his tie in the mirror, already half lost in the day ahead, his mind on meetings and emails and traffic, moving through the house like a guest who knew where everything was but did not linger, and Emily did not blame him, not fully, because they had both slipped into this quiet distance together, one unspoken compromise at a time, choosing comfort over conversation, stability over closeness, and now they lived side by side like two calm lakes that never touched. The coffee maker beeped, sharp and sudden, and Emily flinched, realizing how tense she had been standing there, how often she lived like this now. Braced without knowing why, while Cooper stood and leaned gently against her leg as if reminding her to breathe, and she did, slowly, deeply, surprised by how much that small contact grounded her. She thought back to the woman she had been before, the one who laughed easily, who believed love meant warmth and shared silence that felt full rather than empty, and she wondered when exactly she had stopped expecting those things, when she had decided that wanting more was asking too much. Michael came downstairs, kissed her cheek out of habit, and reached for his keys, and the kiss was polite and brief and carried no question in it, and Emily watched him with a dull ache that no longer felt sharp enough to demand action, only heavy enough to carry, and Cooper watched too, his head tilting slightly, as if he sensed the space between them. Emily bent down and ran her hand through Cooper's fur, warm and real beneath her fingers, and for a fleeting second she felt a sense of comfort so strong it scared her, because it came easily, without effort, without disappointment, and she wondered what it meant that this comfort came not from the man she had promised her life to, but from a dog who asked nothing except her presence. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows, and Emily straightened, telling herself she was overthinking, that mornings were always quiet, that marriages changed, that this was normal, but the thought felt thin and unconvincing, like a story she had told herself too many times. Michael paused at the door, glanced back at her as if he wanted to say something, then didn't, and the door closed softly behind him, leaving the house still again, except for Cooper's steady breathing and the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, counting moments she felt slipping away. Emily moved to the living room and sat on the couch, Cooper following close, resting his head on her knee with complete trust, and as she stared out at the falling snow, she realized that for the first time in a long while, she did not feel invisible, and that realization landed with both comfort and fear, because it raised a question she wasn't ready to answer yet, a question about what love was supposed to feel like, and why she had almost forgotten. She closed her eyes, leaning back, letting the quiet surround her, and somewhere deep inside, beneath years of patience and compromise, something stirred, fragile but awake, as if this simple morning had cracked open a truth she could no longer ignore, and as Cooper stayed close, warm and steady, Emily sensed that whatever had changed was only beginning, and that the calm she felt now was not an ending, but the first sign of something coming that would challenge everything she thought she understood about her marriage, her loneliness, and herself. Emily Harper had learned to live in the quiet spaces between herself and Michael, filling the gaps with routines and memories of what their love had once promised, but over time, those memories had begun to feel like stories she read long ago, familiar but distant, and she often caught herself tracing the lines of the house they had bought together, noticing how small changes in light and shadow seemed to mirror the small changes in them, the way Michael now moved with careful neutrality, polite and efficient, always present but never fully there, and she realized that 5 years had passed since the laughter and late-night conversations had slipped away, leaving only a soft, polite coexistence where love was assumed but never spoken aloud. Emily remembered how it had begun, the excitement of meeting Michael in Boston, the shared coffee shops, the walks through the Charles River, the endless conversations that made nights feel like mornings, and how effortless it had felt to fall in love when every touch and glance promised understanding and connection. And yet, as they settled into married life, the routines took over, and conversations shrank, and the emotional gaps widened until she barely recognized the man she had once dreamed of knowing completely. It was during this slow erosion that Cooper came into their lives, a golden retriever with soft eyes and endless patience, meant to help Emily cope with her mother's passing, a grief she had carried silently because she did not want to burden Michael, who was often too distracted by work and responsibility to notice her small cracks. And at first Michael accepted Cooper's presence with polite approval, keeping a safe distance from the dog while Emily immediately connected, feeling the warmth of another being who needed her as much as she needed him, someone who asked nothing complicated, who simply wanted to be with her. Every morning, Cooper waited by her bedroom door until she woke, nudging her gently, tail wagging in quiet insistence, and every evening he was there at the door to greet her, a presence so constant and devoted that Emily felt her anxiety soften, her tension ease, and the silent ache that had settled in her chest for years began to loosen, leaving small spaces where light could enter, spaces Michael seemed unaware of, because he measured love in practical terms, in stability, in the kind of support that came with routine, never realizing that Emily craved attention, warmth, and reassurance, the feeling of being truly seen, and Cooper gave all of that effortlessly, his presence speaking a language Michael had never learned to use. Emily noticed the subtle changes in herself, a lighter step in the mornings, a hum on her lips while cooking, a small smile that came uninvited when Cooper jumped onto the couch beside her, resting his head against her shoulder as if to say, "I understand," and she felt an emotional awakening that had been dormant, a sense of connection that Michael had tried to provide but failed to translate into gestures that mattered, and each day, the contrast became clearer, a quiet reminder that what she needed was not grand gestures or promises, but someone who saw her in the small moments and stayed. And while Michael continued to move through the house with politeness and efficiency, she increasingly turned to Cooper for the intimacy of presence, for the understanding that had eluded her for years. The evenings became a rhythm of silent companionship between Emily and Cooper, reading by the lamp, sharing quiet laughter at small mishaps, talking aloud to the dog about things she would never say to her husband, revealing thoughts and feelings with honesty and vulnerability, and in those moments she felt alive, remembered, important, and safe. Emotions that had almost faded into routine were now rekindled by the loyalty and attentiveness of a creature who asked for nothing but her attention. Michael noticed these subtle changes but misinterpreted them, thinking that Emily's happiness was a phase or a distraction, failing to see that the bond she shared with Cooper was more than comfort. It was an emotional bridge that Michael had neglected to build, a connection that reminded her daily of what it meant to feel cherished and present. And it was not long before Emily realized that Cooper had not just filled a void, he had taught her what it meant to be understood without explanation, a language of love she had craved, a gentle insistence of being seen, and every wag of his tail, every quiet nuzzle, every moment he stayed by her side was a subtle reminder that emotional presence mattered more than stability or practicality, lessons that Michael had never mastered despite his intentions. And while Emily's heart softened and opened in ways it hadn't in years, a new tension began to surface, a quiet ache of longing for Michael to notice not just the change in her mood but the source of it, to see the dog as more than a pet, to recognize the emotional work Cooper was doing that he himself had failed to do, and she wondered if he could ever truly learn what she now understood so clearly, that love was not just about showing up in body or keeping promises, but about truly being present, listening, responding, and letting someone feel seen in the ordinary moments of life. And she began to notice how small gestures had power, the way Cooper rested his head against her lap, the way he leaned into her when she was tired or anxious, the way he seemed to read the moods in her eyes and respond with perfect timing. Emily spent hours watching him, thinking about the contrast between him and Michael, realizing that her marriage had been full of people trying to do love in the wrong way, measuring care by stability, forgetting that attention and presence were equally vital, and Cooper's quiet devotion had awakened something she had almost forgotten she deserved, a reminder that connection was built through understanding, patience, and consistency, and while she didn't want to feel resentment, she couldn't help but notice that in a few years, a dog had achieved what her husband hadn't in 5 years of shared life, showing her what it meant to be truly acknowledged and cared for. A lesson she carried with both gratitude and sadness, a lesson that set the stage for change she wasn't yet ready to confront, because she realized that the slow unfolding of this new emotional awareness would either bring her and Michael back together or reveal a distance too wide to bridge, and as she sat by the window watching snowflakes fall, Cooper curled at her feet, she understood that she was at the edge of something transformative, a quiet awakening that was as tender as it was painful, and the days ahead would demand courage, honesty, and perhaps a willingness for Michael to see her heart in ways he never had before. Evenings in the Harper house had a rhythm all their own now, a slow, quiet rhythm that Emily found both comforting and bittersweet, because every time she sat on the couch with Cooper resting his head in her lap, she felt a surge of emotion she could not easily name, a mixture of love, longing, and sorrow that was tied not just to her grief and loneliness, but to the distance that had grown between her and Michael over 5 years, a distance measured not in words or fights but in absence, in the small things that were never said, in the way he moved through the house without truly noticing her, without touching the fragile corners of her heart that craved attention, presence, acknowledgement, and while Cooper had begun to fill that void, bringing warmth and reassurance with every wag of his tail, every gentle nudge, every patient gaze, the reality of her marriage remained, stubborn and unresolved, and one evening, as she brushed Cooper's fur near the fireplace, the soft glow of the flames dancing across the walls, Michael finally spoke, his voice low, cautious, as if testing the waters of a conversation he had avoided for years. "You seem happier," he said, and the simplicity of the statement struck her more profoundly than anything he had ever said in months, because it carried an unspoken question, a subtle recognition of something he had not fully understood, and Emily looked up, startled by the honesty of her own feelings, realizing she wanted him to ask more, to notice not just the surface of her mood but the reason behind it, the quiet presence that had reshaped her days, the emotional safety that Cooper had provided, and yet she knew how easily Michael could misinterpret it, how easily he could dismiss it as a passing phase or the charm of a pet, and still, for the first time in years, she spoke the truth without hesitation, letting a small, clear word escape, "I am," and the weight of that truth hung between them, heavy, almost fragile, a reminder of the emotional gaps that had long defined their marriage, the slow erosion of intimacy that neither of them had admitted aloud, and as Michael nodded, unsure how to respond, Emily felt a tender ache of longing, a quiet hope that he might finally see her, might finally try, and she realized that for years she had been speaking a language he could not hear, that her needs had been invisible to him not because he was cruel but because he did not understand that love required presence, emotional attention, and care beyond practicality, and in that moment she understood that Cooper had done in months what Michael had not done in years, made her feel emotionally safe, valued, noticed, and cherished, and the realization was both a comfort and a sting, because it forced her to confront the painful truth that her heart had been nourished by a creature who could not speak, who could only feel and act, while the man she had promised forever to had failed to recognize what she truly needed. Later that night, Emily lay awake, Cooper curled beside her like a living pillow, steady breathing reassuring her, and she replayed the day in her mind, thinking of Michael's cautious tone, the simple words that had not been enough, the absence of deeper acknowledgement, and she wondered if he could ever learn to meet her in the ways that mattered, to understand that love was not measured by provision alone, not by effort or stability, but by emotional engagement, by showing up fully, by noticing the small shifts in mood, the quiet struggles, the silent yearnings. And the contrast between what Cooper gave and what Michael had given was sharp and undeniable, a mirror she could not ignore. Emily thought about the countless evenings she had spent with Michael in the same room, side by side but emotionally miles apart, conversations limited to logistics, schedules, or polite exchanges, never touching the core of her heart, never asking, never reaching, and now, with Cooper's gentle presence, she realized how starved she had been for the simplest acts of empathy and attention, how much she had longed for someone to simply see her, to meet her eyes with understanding, and the tenderness that Cooper offered without expectation illuminated the stark absence in her marriage, a revelation that brought both warmth and pain, because she loved Michael still, yet she could not ignore the truth that he had failed to cultivate the emotional closeness she needed. Emily began to notice little things she had missed before, the way Cooper nudged her when she looked tired, the way he seemed to sense sadness and lean closer, the way his companionship was consistent and patient, teaching her what care could feel like, while Michael often responded mechanically, offering words or gestures that lacked the deep resonance she craved, and each day, each small interaction with Cooper reinforced the lessons she had long forgotten, the importance of presence, attention, emotional safety, and the power of feeling understood without explanation, a power Michael had never fully grasped, no matter how well-intentioned, and Emily felt a mixture of gratitude toward the dog and longing for her husband to awaken to the same truths, to recognize that what she needed was not grand declarations but small, deliberate acts of seeing and caring. As the nights stretched on, Emily felt an emotional tension building inside her, a quiet insistence that she could no longer ignore, a mixture of hope and fear, because while she had found solace and safety in Cooper, she also yearned for Michael to step into the space that had long been empty, to notice her fully, to participate in the emotional intimacy she had quietly nurtured, and she realized that the future of their marriage depended not on gestures or habits alone, but on whether he could understand the lessons Cooper had embodied, on whether he could meet her in ways he had never done before, and this realization was both terrifying and exhilarating, because it promised change, confrontation, and the possibility of a renewed connection. Emily felt her heart stretching in ways it hadn't in years, feeling the tension between what was and what could be, between what Cooper gave and what Michael had yet to learn, and she knew that the coming days would demand courage, honest conversation, and emotional risk, that she could not retreat to silence or routine anymore, that the warmth she had discovered could not be ignored, that love required more than presence in body, it required presence in heart and mind, and as she stroked Cooper's fur, watching him settle beside her with unwavering loyalty, she felt a profound mix of gratitude and longing, realizing that while her dog had awakened something vital inside her, the true test lay in whether Michael could respond, whether he could finally bridge the emotional distance that had defined their marriage for 5 long years, and in that quiet, firelit room, with snow falling softly against the windows, Emily understood that love was patient, love was gentle, love was demanding, and love, most importantly, required being fully seen, and that perhaps, just perhaps, Michael could still learn how to see her in the way she had always hoped. It was a night like any other at the Harper house, the snow thick on the ground and the wind rattling the windows, but the ordinary calm shattered in an instant when Emily realized Cooper was gone, the gate left open, the familiar jingling of his collar absent, and panic rose through her chest so fast it made her dizzy, because for the first time she felt the fragility of the comfort he had brought, the way he had become her anchor in days that Michael could not reach her heart, and without thinking, she pulled on her boots, wrapped her coat tightly, and ran into the storm, calling his name over and over, each shout swallowed by the wind, each step heavier than the last, while Michael followed behind her, finally aware of how deeply Emily depended on this small, loyal creature, how much her well-being was tied to the presence of someone who could give her unconditional love when he had failed to notice her for years. And as they searched the empty streets, the fear twisting Emily's stomach into knots, she realized that this panic was more than worry for a dog, it was the realization that everything she had built around emotional safety could vanish in seconds, that the fragile peace Cooper had created in her heart could be destroyed if he were lost, and with each snow-covered step, Michael saw Emily in a new light, stripped of pretense, desperate and raw, her love and devotion on full display, and it frightened him because he finally understood how much he had been absent, how much he had missed, how much he had to repair. Hours passed with their voices hoarse and lungs burning, the snow thickening, footsteps leaving temporary marks in the white expanse, until at last, near the old park where Emily had walked Cooper on sunnier days, they found him, shivering and trapped in a small ditch, eyes wide, tail wagging weakly at the sight of them, and relief hit Emily in a wave so strong it brought tears instantly, a mix of exhaustion, fear, and overwhelming gratitude, as she knelt in the snow, scooping him into her arms, holding him close, feeling the warmth of life returning where she had feared emptiness, and Michael knelt beside her, hands hovering awkwardly at first, unsure how to comfort her or even himself, until he finally wrapped his arms around her, and in that embrace, Emily felt the raw honesty she had longed for, the acknowledgement of her fears, the recognition of her emotional needs, and she realized that for the first time in years, Michael was seeing her fully, not just physically present but emotionally vulnerable and real, and she let herself lean into him, let herself feel that maybe he could learn what Cooper had taught her about care, attention, and presence. The car ride home was silent but not uncomfortable, each of them processing the intensity of the night, the bond between Emily and Cooper palpable. Michael glancing in the rearview mirror at the dog curled safely in her lap, understanding without words that he had been shown the depth of what he had neglected, and Emily felt a mix of relief and hope, realizing that the crisis had forced a confrontation with reality that words could not achieve, that the urgency of fear had bridged the emotional gap Michael had left open for years, showing him what it truly meant to care, to be present, to recognize the emotional anchors in someone's life. And as they entered the warm glow of the house, Emily set Cooper down gently, brushing snow from his fur while Michael stood nearby, hesitant at first but gradually leaning closer, letting his hand rest briefly on her shoulder, a silent promise that he would try, a gesture that carried more weight than any verbal apology, and in that moment, Emily felt a shift inside her, a recognition that love could grow again, that bonds could be rebuilt if attention, effort, and care were applied consistently, and she thought of all the nights she had sat quietly with Cooper, feeling what she had been missing from her husband, and realized that this near loss had made Michael see the value of presence, of devotion, of emotional responsiveness, and it sparked something tentative but real between them, a possibility that had been dormant for too long. That night, as they dried off the snow and warmed themselves by the fireplace, Cooper finally settled between them, his small body a bridge of comfort and connection, and Emily watched Michael carefully, noticing the first flickers of empathy and understanding, small attempts at reaching toward her heart, a recognition that what he had ignored for years could no longer be overlooked, and she felt a cautious optimism that change was possible, that the emotional gap could be crossed if both of them committed to being present and attentive in ways that mattered. Emily realized that Cooper had been more than a companion, he had been a teacher, guiding her toward awareness of what she truly needed in love, and in that moment, as she looked at her husband and saw him trying, stumbling, and yet willing to be vulnerable alongside her, she felt the beginnings of forgiveness, a gentle opening of her heart, understanding that mistakes of absence could be repaired if met with honesty and action, and the night stretched on with a quiet intimacy that had not existed before, each small gesture, each glance, each touch of hand or fur carrying weight, signaling a shift that was profound and lasting. Emily thought about the journey they had shared, the distance that had grown, the lessons Cooper had provided, and the possibility that Michael could finally step into the emotional space he had ignored for years, realizing that love required awareness, presence, patience, and understanding, and that the dog who had once been a source of solace had become the catalyst for change, teaching Michael and Emily alike that connection is fragile, must be nurtured, and sometimes is awakened only by crisis, by fear, by the realization that what is loved can be lost. And as Cooper nestled between them, warmth radiating through the room, Emily felt a cautious hope blooming, a recognition that the night's terror had created an opportunity for growth, for understanding, for the rebuilding of a marriage that could now be guided by awareness, care, and a tender willingness to truly see one another, marking the beginning of a chapter where fear, love, and devotion intersected to forge a path toward emotional closeness, a path she hoped Michael would walk with her.